Chapter 9, Friday, April 6th, 1984. Under the classroom clock, far from the invigorating sunlight slicing through the windows, Donnie buried his head in his arms. As the sound of Mr. Garrett's scratching on the chalkboard faded, Donnie fantasized of rescuing Tina Barnes from the clutches of Chad and his friends. Donnie's imaginary, long, clean, rock and roll hair flowed in the wind as he fought them, wasted them one by one with his best Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris kung fu ninja moves, some of which he'd learned from the movie Enter the Dragon, though none of which he could say he'd actually mastered. Then Tina, in the shining leotards and leg warmers he'd seen her wear when he peeked through the dividers during gym class, fell into his strong arms, eternally grateful to her hero and forever his girlfriend. His pulse quickened as he imagined her slim, smooth physique, her soft lips against his, lifting him from the depths of Lonersville, nerddom, dorkdom, validating him. Her form evaporated, and his heart hurt. As sleep settled upon him, he thought of curtains, soft lace curtains, hundreds of them glowing in afternoon light, thousands of them parting, slowly revealing something beautiful. He felt he'd been there before, a wanderer on older paths, someplace real, a reoccurring dream, but not a dream. He pushed aside a low tree branch, the thin bark and twigs scratching the palm of his hand. Feeling the warmth and moist air turn subtly cool, he stepped into the shade of a grand canopy of chestnut trees. Insects winked in and out of beams of sunlight that peppered the forest floor. Burdock leaves spread grandly, trying to catch leftover sunlight, like pets waiting for crumbs under the table. In the deepest shade, where the ground was moist, tiny white mushrooms minded their own business, and boulders, hidden behind ferns and berry bushes, peeked out with the occasional breeze that conversed steadily with the treetops. The place felt like home. The path he followed descended a steep bank toward the sound of water. Carefully stepping over a moss-covered log, he thought he heard something else below the birdsong that surrounded him. A voice floated in the breeze, a pretty voice that seemed to appear and disappear with the moving tree shadows. He followed it, then stopped, surprised to see, nearly hidden by ferns, a girl sitting at the sandy edge of a pool of water. Long dark hair covered her bare shoulders and back. Her hands softly stroked what he thought might be a white horse lying next to her. Her seeming nakedness and the words of her song drew him closer. As the sunlight makes the grass glow in golden fields of evening fire, I stand amazed and swallowed by your light, torn away from mind and space, and in your bosom lies a well, carried burning from that place. Forgotten memories and lonely trails, reflecting teardrops on my face. Wanting to see her better, he reached to move aside ferns that blocked his view, and a twig cracked in the trees behind him. The sound came from the direction of a tangled, shadowy place where no sunlight touched. A sense of something evil caused his throat to tighten. He waited, head turned and eyes searching for movement. The girl stopped singing. Donnie froze, afraid to get caught spying on her. A voice hissed from the depths of the dark place in the trees. Fish lips. As if surrounded by a whirlwind, Donnie felt himself reaching, lost, confused, and instantly longing for what seemed to him to be paradise, and more than that, for the girl. For a moment, during that infinitesimal blink of an eye before the dream disintegrated, her head turned, and he saw the side of her face, and he loved her. The dirty desktop, adorned in mysterious messages scrawled and scratched by former occupants, pressed against Donnie's drool-smeared chin. He opened his eyes, and they focused on the VH carved into the laminate, a tribute to Van Halen, a group he listened to, at least when it came on the radio. He picked up a pencil and stabbed it into the grooves of the letters, grinding the graphite into the little canyons they made. Fish lips. Those words had power, like a violent slap. His eyes shifted a tiny flicker, but he controlled them. Ignore him and he'll leave you alone. Ignore him and he'll leave you alone. Ignore him and he'll leave you alone. The mantra a school behavioral counselor had once given him turned to venom. His fist tightened on the pencil, and the graphite tip disintegrated. Adult lies did no good in moments like these. It was like turning the other cheek into a red-hot branding iron, and he asked God why, of all the math classes Chad could have been transferred to, did it have to be this one? He could still feel the air and touch the ferns of his dream, as if he'd really been there. The girl's voice had floated to him like a sweet fragrance, and he wanted to hear it again. A tear slid from the corner of his eye and dropped onto the desk under his cheek. "Hey, Carp!" Chad Eaton's voice saturated the air around Donnie like something rotten and oily, permeating the air molecules and reverberating in his head. Snickers in the classroom turned to quiet laughs. Chad made twirling motions with his hand as if he were reeling in a big fish. "Are you guys done with the assignment already? Do you want a new one?" Mr. Garrett asked the class, without looking up from his newspaper he was reading. "Yes, Mr. G," Chad said, stopping his fishing pantomime and facing forward. The feigned respectfulness in his voice won a new round of laughs. "Get a good nap there, Donnie?" Mr. Garrett asked. More laughs. Donnie put his head back down without saying a word. The pencil in his fist snapped in two against the desktop. The breeze drew waves and ripples in the grass. Donnie watched it, imagining a hidden message just for him. Something magical, something too deep to decipher. Seagulls cried and swooped as kids tossed them bits of food. Not far away, the low growl of heavy guitars vibrated from a ghetto blaster that sat near Bogey, the kid Donnie recognized from the 7-Eleven. Though they'd seen each other a few times since, they'd never talked. On this day, Bogey's little circle of friends came and occupied the space under the big tree by the ball diamond. In the warm spring sunlight, their music quickened his blood like a heating element. He took the last drink of his milk and, before crushing the carton, looked at the missing person's picture. A pretty girl's face smiled up at him, a mute smear of ink saying, "If you have any information, call this number." He crushed the carton. A new song started, and Jeff turned it up. His long, sandy blonde hair bobbed up and down as the galloping, harmonized guitars increased in intensity. Donnie watched him. "What you doing?" Bogey asked. It took Donnie a second to realize Bogey was speaking to him. He felt his own head begin to bob with Jeff's. He paused, surprised by the way Bogey's eyes had zeroed in on his, the way Bogey sat cross-legged, motionless, with Jeff to his left and Rachel to his right, both of them still bobbing their heads, as if praying to him. They're awesome," Donnie said, referring to the rock group. Bogey glanced at the shop teacher in the distance, who was probably going off to lunch, then took a drag of a cigarette he'd cupped in his hand. He passed it to Rachel, then said, "They're tough." Donnie bobbed his head. "Yeah, right. Tough." Bogey smiled. "Who is it?" Donnie asked. Jeff stopped bobbing his head. Head-banging, everyone called it. Looked at Donnie through the hair that fell over his face and smiled coldly. He took a deep drag of the cigarette, then passed it back to Rachel, who hid her movements behind her own feathered hairdo. A strange, sweet smell drifted in Donnie's direction. He swallowed and glanced at the parking lot. Bogey's washed-out gray eyes stared at Donnie. Iron Maiden. Yeah? Donnie had seen kids wearing Iron Maiden concert t-shirts. The devilish artwork and songs titled like "Hallowed Be Thy Name" and "Number of the Beast" inspired dark images of what he thought might be Satan worship. They intrigued him. "Yeah," Bogey said in a tone of voice that seemed to mock Donnie's ignorance. Peace of Mind album, The Trooper. Stacked on top of the stereo were cassette tapes of other bands. Donnie read names like Ozzy Osbourne, Judas Priest, Y&T, Scorpions, and Diamond Head. Rachel flipped her hair back and it spread cleanly over a faded Levi jacket. A roach clip dangled from somewhere near her ear. She had a small leather headband just at her hairline. "Come here," Bogey said, motioning to Donnie. "Want a puff?" Rachel let out a snort of laughter. "A puff," she said. "That's funny." "Take it," Bogey said. He held the cigarette out to Donnie while Jeff positioned himself strategically between the two and carefully watched the parking lot where the rest of the lunch crowd hung out. 10,000 television commercials with Nancy Reagan screaming for Donnie to just say no passed through his head, but Bogey didn't seem like the type of person one could refuse when he opened the way to his circle. Donnie took the cigarette. No, joint was what they called it, and put it to his lips. Terrified of the drug, he improvised a fake puff and held his breath as Rachel had done. She laughed stupidly. Bogey looked pleased and took it back. Donnie blew away the smoke he trapped in his mouth. "Let's put in some Sabbath," Jeff said. Bogey's attention left Donnie as his eyes became two small stoic points of truth. "Don't," he said to Jeff. "Maiden stays." Jeff hesitated with his hand over the stack of cassettes, seemed to test Bogey with that cold smile, and picked up Heaven and Hell by Black Sabbath. "Don't touch it." Bogey flicked away what was left of the joint. Jeff's smile widened. "Touch," he said, putting his finger on the stereo. "Hey, that was my doobie," Rachel said, chasing the joint out into the grass. Bogey threw a punch, which Jeff dodged. The blinding unrestraint in Bogey's arm confirmed every rumor that he was a brawler, and a brutal one at that. Amused, Donnie watched them spar. "It still had a hit," Rachel said, pawing through the dirty leaves and trash left over from snowmelt. "He's such a dipstick sometimes." Her shirt hung off one shoulder, and Donnie could easily see one of her breasts snuggled deeply into a bra cup. Feeling his face burn, he quickly averted his eyes, hoping she hadn't noticed him looking. "I've seen you around," she said, returning to her place by the stereo. Rachel came across as sophisticated. Though Donnie thought she might be his same age, she could easily have passed for 18. Rumor had it she wasn't a virgin. And here she was, talking to him. He fought to say something, anything that would break his muteness. "Yeah, I hang out places, like 7-Eleven, he said, then winced at how lame that sounded. "For the video games." He turned his head, hoping she wouldn't see how uncomfortable he'd become. "Cool," she said. In the background, Bogey had Jeff in a headlock. Together they fell onto the grass and wrestled. "So, where do you live?" she asked. Dirty images of the apartments, like the HUD development, as everyone called them, their trashy foot-worn lawns, shirtless drunks in doorways, disco and Motown music pouring through windows with torn screens, and stolen and stripped bicycles in the vacant lot behind it, put Donnie once again at a loss for words. He shrugged, then looked out at the kids enjoying their lunch in the sunshine. Rachel kept at it. Her mellow voice and the hint of a sincere smile made him want to open up. He liked her, but not simply because she was good-looking. She had a way about her he thought he could trust. She seemed to want to talk to him regardless of his second-hand clothes and greasy hair. The bell rang, and he groaned and collapsed onto the grass. "I know what you mean," she said. He wondered if she truly did. Bogey and Jeff came stumbling back, out of breath. Neither talked, but they both laughed and rested. Bogey aimed his eyes at Donnie again. "Dude," he said, "so you like Maiden? They're tough." Bogey smiled as he turned off the tape player, which ejected the case. He then carefully, if not respectfully, opened the shiny new case, slipped in the cassette, then extended it to Donnie. Bogey's steady hand seemed to hover in place. Jeff's eyes shifted back and forth from Donnie to Bogey. Donnie tried to speak. "For the nachos. Borrow it. I trust you." The breeze blew Bogey's hair gracefully to the side, the image of a gallant movie hero. Mimicking the care in Bogey's fingers, Donnie took the tape. "When do you want it back?" he asked. Whenever you're done listening to it. I trust you, Bogey said again. Yeah, okay, Donnie said. They parted ways. The trio walked in the direction of the gym, Donnie walking through the parking lot toward the lunchroom. He felt tempted to leave the tray out on the grass, but something about his encounter with Bogey, Rachel, and Jeff ennobled him. He didn't want them to think he was a scrounge. On the lunchroom doors, someone had posted a flyer advertising an arts and crafts class. They'd used a photo of the bronze sculpture being hung in the New Cyprus Library, depicting an Indian warrior in the act of hunting buffalo. Such a graceful scene was out of place, overlooking trash and dirty tables left behind by inconsiderate students. Donnie dumped his tray and contemplated the warrior's thin, muscular arm and drawn arrow, forever frozen in that moment of tension. Realizing he was the one remaining student in the lunchroom, he stopped. The feeling of his dream returned, pushing away the chatter and rush in the halls and the busy kitchen noise. The room seemed to expand until it became something insubstantial. He closed his eyes, not sure if the breeze that lifted his hair like a caress had come through the open doors, or was of the dream world he'd so dearly missed. When he opened his eyes again, the warrior's horse on the flyer took on a lifelike look. Donnie blinked, and still he felt as if he could touch the horse, stroke it, maybe ride it. The second bell was about to ring, and he wanted to run out the back doors, across the ball field, through the sun-heated gate in the fence, through the neighborhoods, to somewhere with trees and meadows and solitude. The flumes. In the hall, bodies blew past like a swirling desert wind. He stared at the Iron Maiden tape cover and felt as if he had moved in slow motion. The angular script, written in red, formed the band's name across the top. In cursive, Peace of Mind hung below it, almost a signature. But what drew his attention the most was the straight-jacketed beast, mascot called Eddie, chained at the neck in a padded room. Hollow eye sockets aglow with unholy points of light, a rotting corpse animated by pure feral rage. The ridiculous, evil coolness of it inspired an irreverent desire to spread its dark gospel around the world. Donnie's fingers tingled with the need to trace it onto his notebook and bedroom wall. As if from nowhere, Chad slapped the tape out of Donnie's hand. Pieces of plastic cover exploded off a locker and shattered under the hall's relentless foot traffic. The cassette spun away, booted around like a hockey puck. "Lose something, Carp?" Chad asked. Horrified, Donnie scrambled over the floor, chasing the cassette and trying to gather the pieces of the case before they were crushed. As he reached for the paper insert with the band's name and artwork, he felt Chad's heavy foot connect solidly against his butt, causing him to sprawl. His chin burned over dirty tile, and for an instant he got a close-up glimpse of a girl's shoes before she hopped out of the way. She wore new, clean shoes, and her ankles were petite, legs slim and smooth and tan. Donnie looked up to see Tina Barnes. "Oops!" James Healy yelled. Though humiliated and raging inside, Donnie's first concern was the cassette. It rested at the base of a row of lockers. He crawled through a gathering forest of legs. What he thought of most was Bogey's eyes. "I trust you." "Aw, little fishy's learning to crawl," Greg Hunt said. He was by far the creepiest of the quartet, a sort of push-around guy Chad probably tolerated just for kicks. He wasn't respected, and his propensity to make girls uncomfortable by staring at them and following them home was common knowledge. Word was he'd been kicked out of the swimming pool for sneaking into the girls' locker room and hiding behind a shower curtain. Whether that was true or not, Donnie didn't miss the injustice of being on his hands and knees as if he were something less than Greg. "What's this?" Travis Marty asked, picking up the paper insert with the cover art and song lyrics. "Fishy's listening to Iron Maiden. He's a bad boy. He's a big, mean rocker." Donnie stood, cradling the pieces of tape case along with the cassette. "Give it to me." Travis dangled it challengingly in front of Donnie's face. Donnie swiped at it. "Get it," Travis said. Laughs from a gathering crowd, Tina among them. His sweet feelings and thoughts for her crushed his heart like an avalanche. "That's not mine," Donnie said. "Gosh, I guess it's finders keepers then," Travis said, his eyes swimming with sick glee. Donnie made another swipe. More laughs. "Kick his ass, Travis," someone from the crowd said. "Pussy," Chad sang. He took a step closer, his tall, thin stature looming and contempt on his face. His voice quieted. "You gonna do something about it?" Facing 4 against 1, Donnie trembled. His face flushed and his free hand tightened into a fist. "Oh, yeah, give me a reason," Travis said, thrusting out his chest and doubling his fists. The shop teacher, Mr. Arbin, probably back from lunch, turned the corner. "Break it up." Greg quickly melted into the hall traffic. James put his hands in his pockets and tried to look like a bystander. Chad's face changed from mean arrogance to bewildered innocence. "What's going on here?" Mr. Arbin asked. "Nothing." Travis threw the paper insert at Donnie's face. "Iron Maiden sucks anyway." "Hey, get moving unless you want a trip to the office." Mr. Arbin flapped his hands as if shooing chickens. Donnie picked up the paper insert that was folded and torn where Travis had held it. Fighting tears, he tried to reattach the plastic tape cover and saw it was cleanly broken where the 2 parts hinged. He fit them together as best he could, then slipped in the paper insert and the cassette. He heard someone pass and snicker, probably disappointed he didn't get to see Donnie pounded into the ground. "I trust you." The second bell rang, and Donnie worked the tape into his pocket. He didn't care that he was late for science class. He was failing it anyway. Greg Hunt was in there, too. Donnie hoped Greg would be just as late, so the attention wouldn't be completely on Donnie when he entered the room, but he wouldn't count on it. Head hung low, as if under a heavy weight, staring at the floor, he passed the offices and front entrance. Midday light reflected off the glass doors, illuminating a poster of a crusader on a white horse advertising literacy. The bright reflection focused directly onto the horse. Donnie stopped to look at it. The crusader held his sword high, his shield a book, and the horse, eyes blazing, reared with power and strength. He lowered his head once again and slowly walked to class. That afternoon, the Ochre Mountains shone like jewels in the spring sun. A puddle in the gutter reflected white clouds and blue sky. A school bus left behind a thick cloud of black smoke and hot wind that caused Donnie to bury his face in his shirt. He waited for the stoplight to change and watched an idling black Trans Am that reminded him of Burt Reynolds' car in the Cannonball Run. The driver sported a cowboy hat and a dark mustache, and his stereo blared mountain music by Alabama. Behind him was a light blue Dodge Aspen full of kids. On its bumper a sticker read, "Reagan Bush, 84. One of the kids hung a Cabbage Patch doll out the window. Donnie crossed the intersection, stepping over flattened bottle caps and tiny pieces of broken glass. He approached the cafe, closed and vacant, except for the flaking paint sign on the windows that read "Wings." Rusting pillars and their bases overgrown with elm trees and dry grass held a billboard sign that flanked the building. Not far away in the car wash, a slender woman wearing a bikini top and jeans washed her Jeep. But that wasn't what interested Donnie. The Nash House, a stately red brick Victorian, stood against a backdrop of massive trees and horse pastures. The dike that retained 80 years of Kennecott mine tailings spread against the horizon, blocking any view of the Great Salt Lake that might have been there generations before. He thought of Nancy's pretty face and blank eyes, shook his head, and succumbed to the aroma of cooking food that drifted from the taco time next door. Once inside, he ordered Mexi fries from the girl behind the counter. Karma Chameleon by Culture Club bopped in the background. The wimpy harmonica and unmanly voice polluted his mind like a virus. He tried to think of one of the Iron Maiden songs he liked, but to no avail. As soon as he had his order in hand, he was out the door. KRSP-AM, the radio station that proved there was a devil in hell, seemed to follow him wherever he went. If it wasn't his retarded neighbors with it on the stereo, it had to be some new wave girl with fishbait earrings behind the counter. Madonna, Michael Jackson, Eurythmics, Spandau Ballet, Duran Duran, Cyndi Lauper. The list went on and on in his head. His dad, whenever he was around, listened to Rock 103 FM and the oldies. That's where Donnie got to hear Journey, Styx, Boston, and even new ones like Quiet Riot and Def Leppard, real rock with heavy guitars that lifted him. But then there was Iron Maiden, something even Rock 103 FM didn't play on the radio. He touched the tape in his pocket and felt the broken pieces of the case move, mortally wounded like a crushed rib cage. finishing off the last of his food. The small order didn't fill him up. He passed Safeway and tossed the little paper bag into an overflowing garbage can. Through one of the large plate glass windows painted over with that week's sales, he watched for the good-looking girl that worked the checkout counter. When he saw her, mainly her blonde hair, he left satisfied and continued on toward the Peel Funeral Home and the grub box, and repented for having bought the Mexi fries when he could have had grub box fries. His feet scraped over the old concrete sidewalk along Main Street. A dry breeze made the large green elms, cottonwoods, and box elders whisper secrets only they knew. Lines of train cars, dwarfed by the massive Kennecott power plant, dotted the foothills like necklaces. The farther west he traveled, past boarded-up businesses, discarded liquor bottles, and bars, the more the sense of history weighed upon him like sadness. Other towns never felt like places he could call home. My town. In some ways, Magna, historic Pleasant Green, did. It could have been because of Grandma, so he was already familiar with it when his family left Florida after his dad's attempt at a landscaping business went bust. Mom had talked about it once in a while, but not longingly. The only reason she agreed to move back, it seemed, was because an uncle Donnie didn't know had turned Dad on to some job openings at Kennecott, one of which he was actually able to land. He paused to look at a construction site across the street next to a business called the Transomatic. He'd heard it would be a new car wash. A truck full of kids from his school shot past, and Donnie felt invisible. The usual movie posters hung in the Gem Theater window, except a new one that advertised Ghostbusters, which looked like it would be a cool movie because it had the old Saturday Night Live guys in it. Popcorn smell drifted in the air as he passed, and still upset about Chad, Donnie glanced warily over his shoulder in case he was around. A broken beer bottle neck skidded away from his foot. Behind Webster Elementary School, he finally found the place Kendra had talked about. Long ago, someone had separated some links in the fence to create an opening large enough for a person to slip through. Over it, a rusted, bullet-riddled sign, barely legible, read, Kennecott Property. Donnie was more interested in the way the metal peeled around the bullet holes and craters than any warning the sign provided. He ducked through. The moist trail, flanked by new tender green grass, stretched into the trees. Along the way, he found a spent shotgun shell, 12-gauge, weather-faded and full of spiderwebs. He cleaned it out with a dry piece of sagebrush, then put it in his pocket, thinking Corey would want it. The air was cooler under the shade of tangled Russian olive and box elder trees. Donnie stopped at the edge of a canal. Small frogs leapt into murky water. Fallen blossoms floated on its serene surface. He followed the bank until it widened into a large pool. Above it, water cascaded from the flumes, a wooden and concrete aqueduct constructed during Kennecott's early days. It towered over the pool, and from its mouth hung a long knotted rope. The pool itself sloped under the waterfall, attractively dangerous in that no one really knew how deep it was, according to some, or what was at the bottom, only that it was lined by heavy iron crusher bearings and coated with a gray slime that covered everything the water touched. Local kids swam in it, even bragged about sliding down the slimy flume. The challenge was to catch the rope in time to be able to use it as a swing. Where the embankment sloped on the side of the canal, a single ash tree gave itself away in brilliant new greens among the thick gray-greened Russian olives and blossoming plum trees. A magpie squawked and hopped within its branches, disturbing some blossoms that fluttered down like glitter in the late afternoon light. They landed in the tall grass and low branches, and to Donnie's surprise, something moved in the shadows. He froze, terrified that he wasn't alone, and once again he was aware of the dream feeling that still followed him since math class. The feeling increased in intensity, and insects buzzed around him in the sunlight. Fear hardened in his chest. He waited, listening to his own heartbeat and thinking about stories he'd heard, how some people believed the flumes were haunted. According to local lore, a whole company village once filled the area beyond the canal, all the way to the foothills. Ragtown, the old folks called it. But for reasons lost to newer generations, the tenants had moved, and the buildings had been razed. Once, Baga Maestas, one of his mother's friends, came over and talked about meditation and spirit guides. She swore up and down that her son, Ernie, who was several years older than Donnie and already in jail, had seen something down in the flumes. She claimed the place was evil and thin. He'd been out drinking with friends and went missing for several days. One morning, Baga went out to feed the cats and found Ernie, a stinking mess, stumbling around the backyard and babbling about demons. Civilization suddenly felt 1,000 miles away, and Donnie couldn't move. He hoped whatever was in the shadows might be nothing but a stray dog, but the electric vibrations through his body said otherwise. At the moment he was about to flee, he heard soft humming, a girl's voice, and, as if buffeted by a storm, felt himself pushed between two worlds. He followed the sound into the thicket. Blossoms tumbled and swirled around him, brushing his face and causing him to blink and wave them away like insects. Pushing aside a branch, his hand stopped and his throat closed in mid-breath. Nancy Nash lay curled in the grass, covered with scratches and insect bites. And she was naked. Pony rides, the sunbeam high, she sang in a soft whisper. She held a toy horse and stroked its mane. When she lifted her arm, he saw the edge of her breast. Take me far away. Donnie's head pounded. Ere my Eden's wind doth blow, in paths of light I'll stray. Dusty wind created a moving light show over her skin and over the earth, making them seem as one, and more blossoms cascaded both around her and Donnie. A snowstorm of blossoms. Profoundly moved both physically and emotionally by the vision, he wondered seriously for the first time what it would be like to touch a woman, to be in love and be loved back. The wind seemed to blow through him, and he felt as if Nancy was the very girl he'd seen in his dream. In fact, on a deeper level, he felt as if the dream had been a vision of the future, of this moment. Her voice drew him closer. The horse danced in the air above her, capturing tiny rays of light in its mane and tail. As she turned over in the soft leaves and grass, she set the horse down, and Donnie saw all her beauty. Their eyes met. In less than a second she was on her feet, hunching and twisting in vain to cover herself. Then she ran. "Wait!" Donnie yelled. Soft box elder saplings whipped behind her as she fled into the trees. Surprised at her swiftness, Donnie hesitated. After a few seconds, he glimpsed her moving form in the sunlight. She doubled back to the trail. "Wait!" he yelled. "It's okay!" He chased her until he lost sight of her beyond the grove of trees. Grassy open space, dotted with sagebrush, sloped from the hills to the edge of town. Donnie found her footprints in the dust and followed them along the trail until they abruptly ended, as if she'd taken flight. The toy horse lay in the grass at the edge of the trail. He picked it up, brushed it off, then looked around. Unsure which way to go, he hiked along the edge of the trees toward Kennicott. Thin grass seeds, like needles, stuck in his socks, stabbing his skin, causing him to itch. When he reached the canal, he followed it back in the direction of the flumes. Nancy had simply disappeared. Yellow sunset light colored Salt Lake County police cars parked on the Main Street side of the Nash house. Neighbors gathered. Mrs. Nash, looking tired, held the toy horse as she spoke to one of the officers. Donnie watched her face, so similar to Nancy's but older. Mr. Nash put his hand comfortingly around her shoulder. Bogey, Jeff, and Rachel stood quietly out of the way, haloed by light that came through the trees in the backyard. Bogey gave Donnie a friendly head toss in recognition. Donnie sent one back, still aware of the broken Iron Maiden tape in his pocket. On the other side of the yard, Chad and his lesser demons stood among volunteers who had come to help find Nancy. Considering her vulnerability, the thought of them finding her and seeing her naked stirred something potent inside his chest. The officer speaking to Mrs. Nash waved Donnie over. "There's one last thing I need to get straight," he said. "Where exactly were you when you saw her?" Thinking of the no trespassing sign, Donnie hesitated. The officer held his pen over the notepad and stared steadily at Donnie. Mr. and Mrs. Nash also waited intently for his answer. Chad Eaton's voice drifted from a group of kids on the front lawn. "Fishy caught her naked." Raucous laughter. Mr. Nash quickly looked in Chad's direction, his face hardening. Mrs. Nash cleared her throat and turned her eyes toward the ground. "Why don't we try again?" the officer said with strained patience. "The flumes," Donnie said with a whisper. A no-nonsense pen scratched across the notebook page, then paused. "Did you say she ran into the neighborhood?" "No, I said she disappeared before I reached the neighborhood." The kids laughed again. Donnie looked over at them distractedly. Travis Marty's voice carried. Fishy was funkin' on Nutty Nancy. He pumped his hips back and forth. "Shut up, asshole!" Donnie yelled. "Ooh, Fishy's going to get bad." Mr. Nash took the officer aside. As they spoke, Mrs. Nash smiled sadly at Donnie. Behind her, near the street, a woman leaned, almost hidden against a large tree. Her hair was long and stringy, like the hippies in black and white pictures of 60s protests Donnie had seen in books. Though she wore reflective sunglasses, he felt as if she stared directly at him. The song that was all over the radio, Sunglasses at Night by Corey Hart, came to mind. Donnie wanted to laugh. The officer whistled and motioned with his hands. "Can I have your attention, please, folks? I want to say that the Nashes greatly appreciate your show of support at this difficult time, but due to the sensitive situation, we ask that everyone under the age of 18 please return to your homes." Someone from Travis's group snickered. Mr. Nash finally spoke up to Chad's rowdy group. "That means you, so get off my lawn!" Another officer intervened and walked with the group until they were past the house and moving along. "Funkin' fishy!" Travis yelled. The interviewing officer, who'd stepped aside with Mr. Nash, returned and asked, "Would you mind coming with us to point out the exact location where you last saw her? That would be a great help. I'd also like to notify your parents you'll be helping." Donnie nodded. The woman in the dark sunglasses stepped out from behind the tree again. Her mouth stretched into a toothy Jack Nicholson smile, forced like a rictus, wide enough to bite. He was sure by then she'd looked at him. Then he noticed Chad across Main Street by the car wash, stop and stare while the rest of the lesser demons walked on. The woman looked in Chad's direction, and her smile diminished. Donnie thought some sort of communication had passed between the two of them, and it made him nervous. A cold dusk poured over the town as the woman walked to a van covered with peace signs and other designs that made it look ridiculous, parked across the street at the Veterans Memorial. Donnie followed the officer to his car, but not without looking back. He realized he wasn't the only one who noticed the woman. Sandy Nash also watched the van drive away and acted as if she'd just seen a ghost.